They called her desperate. They said she had appeared from nowhere, a merchant's daughter with careful eyes and a modest dress, and set her sights on a duke she had no business admiring. They said she smiled too deliberately, that she positioned herself too well. That women like her always did. They called her a fortune hunter. Not one of them, not a single soul in that glittering dining room, stopped to wonder why a woman who could buy the entire street they stood on would need to hunt anything at all. But that was the thing about Clara Voss. She had never needed anyone to understand her. She had only ever needed them to underestimate her. The invitation had come on a Thursday. Clara had read it twice, set it on her desk, and gone back to her ledgers. She had 3 shipments arriving from Lisbon before the end of the month and a contract dispute in Bristol that required her signature by Friday. A dinner at Ashford House was not, by any measure, the most pressing item on her list. But she had gone, because James Ashford had asked her himself, not through a servant, not through a note passed along by a mutual acquaintance, but in person, standing in the middle of Harriet Wyndham's drawing room with his hat in his hand, looking at her in a way that had made Clara set down her teacup very carefully before she answered. She had said yes. She had not, for a single moment, expected it to go well. Ashford House was everything Clara's own home was not: loud with candlelight, heavy with flowers, full of people who had known each other since childhood and had very little interest in knowing anyone new. Clara arrived in a deep blue dress that was perfectly appropriate and cost more than most of the guests would guess. She wore no jewels except a single pearl at her throat. She had learned long ago that the less she offered people to comment on, the more carefully they watched her, and the more they revealed about themselves in the watching. James found her within minutes of her arrival. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps it was simply that he seemed more at ease here in his own house than he had in Harriet's drawing room. He smiled when he saw her, a real smile, not the polished social variety, and brought her a glass of wine and introduced her to 2 of his friends with a warmth that surprised her. For an hour, it had almost been pleasant. Then Lady Ashford sat down to dinner. She was a small woman, James's mother, fine-boned, silver-haired, with the kind of composure that came from decades of sitting at the head of important tables. She had greeted Clara at the door with a smile so thin it barely qualified as one, and had placed her at the far end of the table, between a hard-of-hearing colonel and a young man who spent the first course talking exclusively about his horse. Clara had managed perfectly well. It was the 3rd course when it happened. Lady Ashford had been speaking to the woman beside her, loud enough to carry, which Clara suspected was entirely intentional, about the particular difficulty of a son who was too kind-hearted for his own good. "There are women," Lady Ashford said, lifting her wine glass with great delicacy, "who develop a very specific talent for recognizing opportunity. One cannot entirely blame them. It is, I suppose, a kind of survival." The table did not go silent, but several conversations slowed. "A fortune hunter," said the woman beside Lady Ashford, younger, less careful, saying plainly what the older woman had wrapped in silk, "is still a fortune hunter, whatever dress she arrives in." Clara did not look up from her plate. She heard the small, sharp intake of breath from across the table. She heard the colonel beside her go suddenly and awkwardly quiet. She felt, without looking, the turn of several heads, and she felt James, 4 seats away, go very still. She waited. The table waited. James said nothing. Clara set down her fork. She touched the corner of her mouth with her napkin. She looked up, not at Lady Ashford, not at the woman who had said the word, but at James directly, for just a moment. He was looking at her. His jaw was tight. His hand had closed around his wine glass. He looked like a man who was about to say something, who was choosing carefully whether to say it. He did not say it. Clara smiled. Not at him. At the table. At no one in particular, the kind of smile that meant absolutely nothing and therefore could not be argued with. "The lamb is exceptional," she said pleasantly to the colonel beside her. The colonel, grateful, agreed that it was. The conversation resumed. James watched her for the rest of the evening. She could feel it, careful, puzzled, with something underneath that she did not yet have a name for. When the guests began to leave, he appeared at her side before she could reach the door. "Miss Voss," his voice was low, "I must thank your mother for a lovely evening," Clara said. "Please." And she left. She did not look back. But she was smiling, really smiling, not the dinner table kind, before she reached the bottom of the steps. The morning after the dinner, James Ashford did something he was not particularly proud of. He asked questions. Not directly, he was a duke, and dukes did not go about openly investigating the backgrounds of women they had invited to their mother's table. But he had connections. A solicitor who knew everyone's business. A friend at his club who had spent 20 years trading in information as casually as other men traded in stocks. By Thursday, he had answers. Clara Voss, age 26. Father deceased 3 years past. Edmund Voss, textile merchant, modest operation, nothing remarkable. Mother deceased, Clara's childhood. No siblings, no living relatives of consequence. She occupied a house on Calloway Street that she leased, according to his solicitor, at a perfectly ordinary rate. She attended church on Sundays, accepted select invitations, and was known among those who knew her at all as quiet, composed, and not particularly forthcoming about herself. Respectable enough, his solicitor had said, with the tone of a man delivering disappointing news. But nothing there, your grace. Modest circumstances, careful woman. James had thanked him and gone to his club, and sat with a glass of brandy. He did not drink and thought about the way Clara had smiled at the end of that dinner. Not the smile she had worn at the table that had been armor, and he had recognized it as such with a shame that still sat uncomfortably in his chest. He meant the other one, the one he had caught just before she disappeared into her carriage. Small, private, directed at no one. The smile of a woman who knew something no one else in the room did. He could not stop thinking about it. Clara, for her part, was thinking about a shipping dispute. The Lisbon contract had arrived with a discrepancy. 40 crates listed, 38 received, and the broker in question was a man who had tried this particular trick once before with a firm that did not have Clara's attention to detail. She wrote him a letter that was extraordinarily polite and left absolutely no room for misunderstanding, sealed it, and handed it to her secretary before noon. Then she opened the ledger on the left side of her desk, the one she kept separate, the one her secretary did not touch, and recorded the morning's figures in her own hand. The numbers were, as they generally were, very good. Clara closed the ledger, locked it, and put the key in her pocket where it always lived. She did not think about James Ashford. Or rather, she tried not to. She was practical enough to admit, in the privacy of her own mind, that he was more difficult to dismiss than she had anticipated. He had kind eyes. He laughed easily. He had looked at her across that terrible dinner table with something that was not pity and not condescension, but something far more inconvenient. He had looked at her like she was someone worth understanding, and then he had said nothing. Clara was accustomed to men who said nothing. Her father had built an empire in near silence and taught her to do the same. Silence, Edmund Voss had always said, was simply the space where other people revealed themselves. James Ashford had revealed himself clearly enough. She did not hold it against him precisely. A man did not argue with his mother at her own dinner table, not without cost, not without consequence. She understood that. She even quietly sympathized. But understanding a thing and accepting it were not the same. It was her secretary, young Mr. Briggs, who mentioned it first. "There's been an inquiry," he said, setting a small note on her desk on Friday morning. "Roundabout sort came through Fielding at the solicitor's office. Someone asking after your father's business, history of the firm, that sort of thing." Clara looked at the note without picking it up. "What did Fielding tell them?" "What you instructed, Miss Voss. Modest textile concern, nothing of consequence." "Good." She pushed the note to the side. "Send Fielding a bottle of the Bordeaux. He has been very reliable." Mr. Briggs nodded and retreated. Clara sat for a moment in the quiet of her office. So James had asked questions. She had expected it sooner, if anything. And he had received the answers she had long ago arranged for people to receive, because there were very good reasons why Clara Voss did not advertise the whole truth of her situation, and those reasons had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with the fact that the world treated a woman with money very differently than it treated a man with the same, and not, in Clara's experience, better. She had learned this at 19, the first time a business associate had smiled at her across a table, and then gone home and told his wife he'd spent the afternoon with Voss's little secretary. She had learned it again at 22, when a man she had briefly, foolishly considered had looked at the figures in her father's ledger, and his eyes had changed, the warmth in them replaced by something calculating and cold. She had decided then that she would rather be underestimated than consumed. And so Clara Voss remained, to all outward appearances, a modest merchant's daughter of comfortable but unremarkable means. The key in her pocket was the only outward sign of anything else, and no one had ever thought to ask about it. She was locking the ledger that evening when her housekeeper appeared in the doorway. "Gentleman at the door, Miss Voss." Mrs. Hale had the expression she reserved for unexpected visitors, not alarmed, simply watchful. "Says his name is Ashford." Clara set the ledger in its drawer, locked it, put the key in her pocket. "Which room is warmest?" she asked. "The front sitting room. Fire's been going since 3. "Show him in," said Clara, "and bring tea." She allowed herself 30 seconds alone in the office, long enough to settle something in her chest that had no business being unsettled, and then she walked down the hall to meet him. James Ashford had rehearsed what he was going to say. He had rehearsed it on the carriage ride over and in the brief, cold walk from the street to the front door, and again in the 30 seconds he stood in Clara Voss's front sitting room waiting for her to appear. He had the words arranged neatly, an acknowledgment of what had occurred, an expression of regret, an assurance that his mother's opinions were not his own. It was a good apology, measured, sincere. Clara walked in and he forgot half of it immediately. She was not dressed for company. She wore a plain dark dress, her hair simply arranged, no jewelry at all, and she looked, somehow, more herself than she had at the dinner, more present, as though the ballroom version of her had been a careful translation and this was the original. She crossed the room without hurry, gestured for him to sit, and settled into the chair across from him with the composure of a woman who had been expecting him, which he realized she probably had. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Voss," he sat, "I came to apologize." "I know." A silence. Mrs. Hale appeared with tea, set it down, disappeared. Clara poured without asking how he took it milk, no sugar, which was correct, and handed him the cup. He accepted it, slightly thrown. "What happened at dinner," he began, "was inexcusable. The remarks that were made I should have." "You should have," Clara agreed pleasantly. He stopped. She looked at him over her own teacup with an expression that was not unkind but was entirely, immovably serious. "You were 4 seats away," she said. "Not 40, you heard it." "Yes." "And you said nothing." No, the word cost him something. He could hear it in his own voice. "I did not." "Why?" It was such a direct question, so undecorated, so devoid of the social cushioning that usually surrounded difficult conversations, that for a moment James simply looked at her. "I don't have a satisfactory answer," he said finally. "I know that too," said Clara, "which is why I'm asking, not to embarrass you. I'm asking because I'd like to understand what kind of man you are." James set down his teacup. "In 20 years of social life, through 2 London seasons, 3 years managing a dukedom and more dinners than he could count, no one had ever said anything quite like that to him. People wanted things from him, feared him, deferred to him, flattered him. Occasionally they argued with him. They did not, as a rule, sit across from him in a plain sitting room and tell him calmly that they were trying to work out his character. He stopped, began again. My mother is not a woman who responds well to public contradiction. No, said Clara, I imagine she is not. It would have caused a scene. It would have, Clara agreed, on my behalf. The room was very quiet except for the fire. James looked at her. I handled it badly. Yes. I am sorry, Miss Voss, genuinely. Clara considered him for a moment, long enough that he felt it, the weight of her attention, careful and unhurried. Then she set down her own cup. I accept that you are sorry, she said. I don't accept the apology. He blinked. I beg your pardon. An apology repairs the person who gives it, Clara said with no particular heat. It relieves their conscience. What happened at that table did not injure my conscience, Your Grace. It injured my name, in front of 20 people who will repeat what they heard for the rest of the season. She folded her hands in her lap. Saying sorry to me privately doesn't repair that. James stared at her. He had come here expecting. He wasn't entirely sure what he had expected. Graciousness, perhaps. Relief. The particular softening that most people produced when a duke arrived at their door to make amends. Clara Voss looked at him as though she were waiting for him to catch up. You're right, he said. I know. Despite everything, he almost laughed. You are remarkably unimpressed by me. I am trying, said Clara, to be fair to you. There is a difference. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside, a carriage passed on the street. What would repair it? He asked. The name, as you say. I haven't decided yet, said Clara simply. I'll tell you when I have. It was a dismissal, gentle, absolute. James recognized it with a strange mixture of frustration and something else entirely, something he did not immediately examine. He stood, reached for his hat, and then he stopped. The room was modest. He had registered that when he entered, filed it away as confirmation of what his solicitor had told him. But he was looking at it properly now for the first time. The chair he had been sitting in was old mahogany, beautifully kept, the kind of piece that aged into its quality rather than out of it. The rug beneath his feet was Turkish, deep red, and not inexpensive. The books on the shelves behind Clara were not decorative. They were red, their spines worn, and there were a great many of them, and they were not novels. He looked at the titles nearest to him. Principles of Maritime Commerce, The Law of Contracts, 3rd edition, A History of the Wool Trade in the British Isles. He looked back at Clara. She was watching him with an expression he could not quite read, patient, perhaps, or careful. The expression of someone who had just noticed that he was noticing. Miss Voss, he said slowly, what was it your father's business dealt in exactly? Textiles, said Clara, without hesitation, without blinking. Yes, said James, of course. He put on his hat. Good evening, said Clara. He walked to the door, paused with his hand on the frame, his back to her. I'll call again, he said, if I may. A brief silence. You may, said Clara. He left. Clara sat for a long moment after she heard the front door close. Then she looked at the bookshelf. At the titles she knew perfectly well were visible from where he had been standing, and she pressed her lips together. She had not moved those books. She wondered if she had meant to. She picked up her teacup, found it had gone cold, and set it back down. Careful, she told herself. But she was smiling again, the real one, the private one, and this time she did not entirely know why. The announcement came on a Tuesday. Clara read it in the morning paper over breakfast, between a report on parliamentary proceedings and an advertisement for a new milliner on Bond Street. It is with great pleasure that Lady Ashford announces the forthcoming engagement of her son, James Edward Ashford, Duke of Ashford, to Lady Cecily Drummond, daughter of the Earl of Wentmore. Clara read it once. Then she turned the page. By noon, 3 people had called on her. Harriet Wyndham arrived first, breathless and indignant on Clara's behalf, and had to be calmed with tea and a firm reminder that there had been no understanding between Clara and the Duke of Ashford. None whatsoever. Nothing formal, nothing even approaching formal, merely 2 conversations and a dinner that had ended badly. "But he called on you," Harriet said, as though this settled the matter entirely. "He called to apologize," said Clara, "which is a different thing. He stayed an hour. He stayed 40 minutes. Clara." "Harriet," Clara set down her cup, "I am perfectly well. Drink your tea." Harriet drank her tea, unconvinced. The second caller was Mrs. Alderton, a neighbor of 50 years and considerable opinions, who arrived under the pretense of returning a book she had borrowed in March, and stayed long enough to say everything she thought about dukes in general, and this one in particular. Clara thanked her for the book and showed her out with great affection. The third caller did not come inside. He sat in his carriage on Calloway Street for 11 minutes. Clara's housekeeper reported this with the precision of a woman who watched the street carefully, and then drove away without knocking. Mrs. Hale relayed this information with her eyebrows raised very slightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Hale," said Clara. She went back to her desk, opened the Bristol contract, read the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing a word of it. Then she closed the contract, opened the left-hand ledger, and spent 2 hours with the only numbers that had never yet failed to steady her. Lady Cecily Drummond was, by every account, exactly what the Ashford family required. She was 22. She was lovely in the particular way that English aristocracy seemed to produce reliably, fair, fine-featured, with good posture and better manners. Her father, the Earl of Wentmore, had a title that stretched back 4 generations and an estate in Shropshire that, while not extravagant, was perfectly respectable. She laughed at appropriate moments, deferred at appropriate moments, and had never, as far as anyone knew, read a book on maritime commerce in her life. Lady Ashford had introduced her at a small luncheon the following Thursday, and the general opinion of those present was that she was charming. James, by the accounts that reached Clara through Harriet, who had a gift for intelligence gathering that Clara had long appreciated, had been polite, attentive, perfectly correct. "He looked," Harriet reported, perching on the edge of Clara's sitting-room chair with great urgency, like a man attending his own very organized funeral. "That is unkind to Lady Cecily," said Clara. "It is accurate about the Duke." Clara said nothing. She was embroidering, or rather, she was holding embroidery which was different, and she kept her eyes on it with great discipline. "He asked after you," Harriet said. The needle stopped. "At the luncheon," Clara asked very evenly. "Afterward, he pulled Edward aside." Edward was Harriet's husband, who moved in the same club circles as the Duke, and asked, quite casually, whether you were well. "That is a very ordinary question." Edward said it was not asked in an ordinary way. Clara resumed embroidering. 1 stitch, 2 stitches, 3. "Harriet," she said, "he is engaged." "He is announced," Harriet corrected. "There is no ring yet. There is no contract signed. There is an announcement in a newspaper that his mother placed, and a luncheon that his mother organized, and a girl that his mother selected." She paused. "I am simply observing that there appear to be 2 distinct parties to this engagement, and only one of them seems to have been consulted." Clara set the embroidery down. She looked at the fire for a moment. "It is not my concern," she said. "No," Harriet agreed. "It isn't." A silence. "He stayed 40 minutes," Harriet added, very quietly. "Not because he felt he had to. Men who come out of obligation leave in 15. Clara picked up the embroidery again. "Good night, Harriet." 3 days later, Clara signed the largest contract of her professional life. It had been 18 months in negotiation. A trading agreement between Hartley Company and a consortium of Lisbon merchants that would, when fully operational, move more wool through British ports than any single private arrangement in the last decade. Her solicitor, Mr. Graves, had been present for the final signing, and had afterward sat very still for a moment looking at the document. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Graves." "This is," he stopped, selected his words with care. "This is a very significant agreement." "Yes," said Clara, "it is." The Hartley name, he hesitated. "You are certain you wish to sign as Voss Hartley? It will raise questions. People will begin to—" "I know what it will do," said Clara. She signed. "E. Voss Hartley, Directress, Hartley Trading Company." Mr. Graves looked at the signature for a long moment. "Your father," he said finally, "would have been very proud." Clara capped the pen, set it down precisely. "I know that too," she said. She walked home through streets that were cold and bright and loud with London's ordinary business, and she thought about her father, about Edmund Voss, who had been born a Hartley and had married a Voss and had loved his wife's name better than his own and kept it long after she was gone, who had taught Clara to read a ledger before she could read a novel, who had said, on the last evening she had spent with him, "They will always try to make you smaller than you are. Your only job is to refuse." She had refused consistently for 26 years. She turned onto Calloway Street and stopped. James Ashford was standing outside her front door. Not in his carriage this time. On foot, hat in hand in the cold, looking at the door as though he had not yet decided whether to knock. He turned when he heard her steps. They looked at each other across the short distance of the pavement. "You've been standing there a while," said Clara. It was not a question. Mrs. Hale would have reported otherwise. "Yes," said James. "You're engaged," said Clara. "I am announced," said James, and there was something in the way he said it, a precision that echoed Harriet's distinction so exactly that Clara felt something move in her chest that she did not welcome. She looked at him for a long moment. The cold had put color in his face. He looked tired, she thought, and determined, and somewhat miserable. "You should go home, Your Grace," she said quietly. "I know," said James. He did not move. Clara looked at him a moment longer than she should have. Then she walked past him up the steps and closed the door. She stood in the hallway with her back against it and her eyes closed and the signed contract still in her bag, the name Voss Hartley in her own ink, and she thought, "Not yet, not like this." From outside, after a long moment, she heard his footsteps move away down the street. She did not move until she couldn't hear them anymore. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, and it was not addressed to James. It was addressed to his mother. Lady Ashford had been at breakfast when Mr. Fielding, the family's solicitor of 14 years, a man so composed that she had never once seen him perspire, walked into the dining room without being announced, which he had never done in 14 years, and placed a folder of documents beside her teacup with the expression of a man who had recently learned something that had reorganized his understanding of the world. "I apologize for the intrusion, my lady," he said, "but I felt this required your immediate attention." Lady Ashford set down her toast, opened the folder, read the first page, then she read it again. Then she sat very still for a moment, looking at the name printed at the top of the document in plain, unadorned letters, and felt the particular sensation of a woman who has been absolutely certain of something for a very long time and has just discovered she was absolutely wrong. She sent for James before she finished the second page. James arrived at Ashford House at 10:30 to find his mother standing at the window of the library. Not sitting, standing, which she almost never did, with the folder open on the desk behind her, and an expression he had not seen on her face since the morning they had buried his father. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She did not turn from the window immediately. He waited, which he had learned as a boy was the only useful thing to do when his mother was composing herself. "Do you know," she said finally, still looking at the street below, "what the Hartley Trading Company is?" James considered the question. "Vaguely. Old firm. Textiles originally, I think. Wool and—" "Textiles," his mother said. "Not any more, not for 20 years." She turned from the window. Her face was composed now, carefully so, but her hands, he noticed her hands, which she had clasped in front of her, were not entirely steady. Hartley Trading Company operates 13 merchant vessels. It holds contracts with the Portuguese Wool Consortium, 2 separate East India partnerships, and 3 of the largest import brokers in London. Its annual revenues, she stopped, pressed her lips together. Its annual revenues are larger than this estate's total worth, larger than the Wentmore holdings, larger than, she stopped again. James had gone very still. Larger than what? He asked. His mother crossed to the desk, turned the folder toward him. He leaned forward and read. The first page was a company summary, standard commercial document, the kind filed with the Board of Trade. He read it quickly, absorbing figures that grew more significant with each line. He turned to the second page. A list of creditors and debtors, standard again. His eyes moved down the column on the right: names, amounts, dates. He reached the third entry from the bottom. He stopped. Ashford Estate, outstanding balance, principal and accumulated interest. The number beside it was considerable, more than considerable. It was the kind of number that rearranged things. He turned to the next page. The creditor listed for the Ashford debt was given in full legal name: Hartley Trading Company. Directress, E. Voss Hartley. James read the name twice. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "How long?" he said. "The debt was acquired 8 years ago," his mother said. She had sat down now across from him with the straightness of posture that was her particular form of armor. "Your father's arrangement with the original Hartley broker. I was aware of the debt. I was not aware," she paused. "I was not told that Hartley had passed to a private directress. I was not told who she was." "Who told you now?" "Mr. Fielding. He was reviewing our accounts in preparation for the Wentmore settlement. The marriage contract requires a full disclosure of outstanding debts, and he found it." She looked at him steadily. "He found that every quarterly payment we have made for the past 3 years has been received by an account registered to E. Voss Hartley." A pause. Clara Voss Hartley. The fire crackled. Outside, London went about its ordinary business, entirely unaware. James looked at the folder. At his family's debt, listed in plain figures, held in the hands of the woman his mother had called a fortune hunter at her own dinner table 12 days ago. "She never said a word," he said, quietly, almost to himself. "No," said his mother, "she did not." She could have, he stopped, thought about what she could have done. She could have introduced herself properly from the beginning. She could have produced the documents at the dinner table and watched the room rearrange itself around her. She could have, at any point in their 3 conversations, informed him that his family owed her a very significant sum of money, and that she had been collecting it quietly for 3 years without once using it as leverage. She had done none of these things. She had sat in her sitting room in a plain, dark dress and poured his tea, and told him that an apology repaired the person who gave it, not the person who received it. She had stood on a cold pavement outside her house and told him to go home. She had signed a contract. He remembered now, suddenly, what Harriet's husband Edward had mentioned at the club, something about a significant Hartley agreement. He had not connected it to Clara, had not had any reason to, and walked home through London carrying it and said nothing. "James." His mother's voice was careful, measured, the voice she used when she was navigating something she had not prepared for. "The Wentmore arrangement is not signed," he said. "The announcement has been made." "Announcements," said James, "can be retracted." Silence. His mother looked at him for a long moment. He could see her calculating, not coldly, not without feeling, but practically, which was how she had always approached the world and which he had, until recently, assumed was the only sensible way to approach it. "She hid this," Lady Ashford said finally. "Deliberately, she concealed who she was, what she was worth, what we owed her." A pause. "That is not the behavior of a straightforward woman." "No," James agreed. "It is the behavior of a woman who has learned, presumably through considerable experience, that the world treats her better when it underestimates her." He looked at his mother directly. "Can you tell me she was wrong to think so?" Lady Ashford said nothing, which was, James knew, its own kind of answer. He closed the folder, stood. "I need to speak with her," he said. "James." "Not about the debt." He picked up his hat from the chair beside him. "The debt is irrelevant." "It is most certainly not." "It is irrelevant," he said again, more quietly, "to what I need to say to her." He left his mother sitting very straight in the library, the folder of documents on the desk between them, and walked out into the cold morning with the particular focus of a man who has spent too long being careful and has just decided, with great clarity and some relief, to stop. He went to Calloway Street. Mrs. Hale opened the door and informed him that Miss Voss was not at home. "Where is she?" James asked. Mrs. Hale, who had, in Clara's service, developed a very sophisticated understanding of which questions to answer and which to deflect, looked at him for a moment with the expression of a woman making a decision. "She walks on Wednesday mornings," she said. "The park, East Path usually. She takes an hour." James looked at her. Mrs. Hale looked back at him with perfect composure and absolutely no indication that she had said anything at all. "Thank you," he said. He found her 20 minutes later. She was on the East Path, as Mrs. Hale had said, walking at a pace that was purposeful rather than leisurely, her coat dark against the gray morning, her hands in her muff, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. She was alone. She was looking straight ahead and thinking about something with the focused expression he had learned to recognize as her working face, the face she wore, he now understood, when she was calculating something that mattered. She saw him when he was still some distance away. She did not stop walking. She slowed slightly, a barely perceptible adjustment, and then continued at the same pace, so that when he reached her they fell into step together as though it had been arranged. For a moment neither of them spoke. The park was quiet, a few other walkers at a distance, bare trees, the sound of their footsteps on the gravel path. "You've seen the documents," Clara said. It was not a question. "This morning," said James. "Mr. Fielding is thorough," she said. "I always expected it would be him." "You expected it?" "Eventually, yes. The marriage settlement would require disclosure, I knew that." She paused. "I didn't know it would be quite this soon." James looked at her profile. She was watching the path ahead, composed, present, entirely herself. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. Clara was quiet for a moment. A long moment, long enough that he didn't think she was going to answer, and then she did. "Because I needed to know something first," she said. "What?" She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. They stood on the gravel path in the cold gray morning, and Clara turned to look at him properly for the first time since he had found her, and her expression was not guarded, not careful, not the measured composure she generally presented to the world. It was something quieter than that, something more tired and more honest and more frightened than she probably intended him to see. "I needed to know," she said, "whether you were a man who could look at a woman with nothing or what appeared to be nothing and find her worth something anyway." She held his gaze steadily. "I have a great deal of money, Your Grace. I have learned at some cost that money makes people very interested in a woman and not at all interested in the woman herself." She paused. "I did not want to be interesting to you because of what I was worth. I wanted to know if I was interesting to you because of—" She stopped, looked away briefly, looked back. "Because of me." The trees were bare and still. Somewhere across the park a bird called once and went silent. James looked at her for a long time. "Clara," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. Not Miss Voss, her name, just her name, said quietly on a cold Wednesday morning in a park where no one was watching. She went very still. "I came to your house to apologize," he said, "before I knew any of it. I stood outside your door in the cold like a fool before I knew any of it. I have thought about you every day for 2 weeks." He stopped, steadied himself. "Every day for 2 weeks, and not once, not for a single moment, was I thinking about what you were worth." Clara looked at him. Her eyes were very bright. She blinked once carefully. "You are announced," she said. Her voice was steady, barely. "I know. Lady Cecily has done nothing wrong." "I know that too." He took one step toward her. "Clara, I have handled almost everything about this badly. I did not speak when I should have. I allowed things to proceed that I should have stopped. I have been careful and measured and appropriately ducal." The word came out with a weariness that surprised even him. "And I am standing here in a park in the cold telling you that I would like very much to stop being all of those things, at least for the next 5 minutes, and simply ask you." "Don't," said Clara softly, not unkindly. He stopped. "Don't ask me anything," she said, "while you are still announced to someone else." She met his eyes. "I have waited for things before. I am not afraid of waiting." A pause. "But I will not be the reason a young woman is humiliated. Not even," she stopped. "Not even," he said. She looked at him for one long, unguarded moment. "Go home, James," she said, very quietly. His name, just his name the first time, returned to him like something precious handled carefully. "And then come back." She turned and walked on down the path. He stood and watched her go, steady, purposeful, her coat dark against the gray morning, and felt something settle in his chest that was not peace exactly but was the thing just before it. He went home. He had a great deal to do. The retraction was published on a Friday. It was brief, dignified, and said very little. The announcement of the previous week had been premature. The families had mutually agreed to withdraw. Lady Cecily Drummond and the Duke of Ashford parted on the best of terms. 3 sentences. The kind of thing that was forgotten by Saturday in most drawing rooms and remembered indefinitely in others. Clara read it at breakfast. She set the paper down, drank her tea, looked out the window at Calloway Street, which was doing its ordinary Friday morning business. A coal cart, 2 women with baskets, a boy chasing something small and fast that disappeared around the corner before she could identify it. She picked up the paper again, read the 3 sentences again, set it down. "Will you be home this afternoon, Miss Voss?" Mrs. Hale asked from the doorway. "Yes," said Clara, "I'll be home." He did not come that day or the next. Clara worked. She reviewed the Lisbon correspondence, which had resolved itself satisfactorily. The missing 2 crates had been located in a warehouse in Porto. The broker had apologized at considerable length, and Clara had accepted the apology with the brevity she felt it deserved. She met with Mr. Graves about the Hartley agreement, which was proceeding well. She attended a small dinner at Harriet's on Saturday evening, and deflected questions about the Duke of Ashford, with a serenity that Harriet found deeply unsatisfying. "You read the retraction," Harriet said, cornering her near the fireplace after dinner. "Everyone read the retraction," said Clara. "You know what I mean." "I do," said Clara, "and I have nothing to say about it." Harriet looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a woman exercising enormous restraint. "Fine," she said, "but you should know that Edward says he looked terrible all week, like a man working through something very difficult very fast." "Retractions are socially complicated," said Clara mildly. "Clara." "Harriet, the salmon is very good. You should have some. He came on Sunday." Not in the morning, in the late afternoon, when the light was already going gray, and the street lamps were just beginning to be lit, and Clara was in her office with the left-hand ledger open, and the fire down to embers because she had forgotten to call for more wood. Mrs. Hale knocked once and opened the door. "The Duke of Ashford," she said, with the faintest possible emphasis that conveyed a great deal. Clara closed the ledger, locked it, put the key in her pocket. "The sitting room," she said, "and more wood for this fire, please." She gave herself no 30 seconds this time. She walked directly down the hall and into the sitting room and found him standing by the window, not looking out of it, simply standing near it, hat in his hands, with the look of a man who had arrived somewhere important and was not yet certain of his welcome. He turned when she came in. He looked, she thought, like himself. More himself than she had seen him, less arranged, less composed, with shadows under his eyes that suggested the week had cost him something, and he had paid it without complaint. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace," said Clara. They looked at each other across the room. "Sit down," she said. "Mrs. Hale will bring tea." "I didn't come for tea," he said. "I know, sit down anyway." He sat. She sat across from him. The fire was low, but the room was warm enough, and Mrs. Hale appeared, built the fire up efficiently, produced tea from somewhere with suspicious speed, and disappeared. James looked at the tea. "She was already preparing it," Clara said. "She expected me." "She is an exceptionally perceptive woman," Clara poured. "How is Lady Cecily?" James accepted the cup. "Dignified," he said, "and I think genuinely somewhat relieved. She was as much her mother's arrangement as mine." A pause. "I called on her personally, to apologize." Clara looked up. "She deserved that much," he said simply. Clara looked at him for a moment. Something shifted quietly in her chest. "Yes," she said, "she did." A silence. Not uncomfortable, the particular silence of two people who have a great deal to say and are deciding where to begin. James set down his cup. "I want to speak about the debt," he said. Clara shook her head slightly. "That isn't necessary." "It is necessary to me." His voice was quiet but very firm. "Please." She stopped, nodded once. "My family owes you a significant sum," he said. "It has been owed for 8 years. You have collected the quarterly payments without fail and without, at any point, using the debt as any kind of instrument. You have not threatened, you have not leveraged, you have not, as far as I can discover, told a single person." He paused. "You could have ruined us. At any moment in 3 years you could have called the debt in full and we would not have been able to meet it." He looked at her steadily. "Why didn't you?" Clara was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the street lamps were fully lit now, small warm circles in the gathering dark. The fire crackled. The clock on the mantel marked the half-hour with a single soft chime. "Your tenants," she said. James blinked. "I beg your pardon." "The Ashford tenants." She folded her hands in her lap. "When I first acquired the debt, when my father's company absorbed the original Hartley portfolio and I went through the accounts myself, I looked into the estates. It is standard practice. You want to understand what you hold." She paused. "The Ashford tenants were well kept. Good cottages, reasonable rents, a school on the estate grounds that your father had built and you had maintained. When the harvest failed in the second year, do you remember? 1887. Several estates reduced their tenant support significantly that season." "We did not," James said slowly. "You did not," Clara confirmed. "You absorbed the loss. The estate ran at a deficit for 2 quarters and you covered it, and you did not reduce a single tenancy or raise a single rent." She looked at him directly. "A man who does that in a bad year is not a man whose estate I wish to destabilize, and so I held the debt." A pause. "And then I met you." James looked at her. "And then you met me," he said quietly. "And then I met you," Clara said. "And I found that you were more complicated than I expected, and less simple than your mother's opinions of you might suggest." A breath. "And I wanted, as I told you in the park, to understand what kind of man you were before I made any decisions about anything." "And now," his voice was very careful, "what have you decided?" Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her father, about Edmund Voss, who had been a Hartley, and had loved a woman more than a name, and had taught his daughter that the ledger told you the truth about people if you knew how to read it. She thought about 19 years of careful management, of deliberate invisibility, of being smaller than she was so that the world would leave her room to work. She thought about a dinner table and an insult wrapped in silk, and a man 4 seats away who had gone still and said nothing. She thought about a park on a cold Wednesday morning, and her own name said quietly like something worth saying. She had been careful for a very long time. She was so tired of being careful. "I have decided," she said, "that you are a man who apologizes to young women he has inadvertently wronged, and maintains his tenant school in a bad harvest year, and stands outside doors in the cold without knocking because he is trying to be honorable and is not entirely certain how. She paused. I have decided that those things matter more to me than most things. James had gone very still. Clara. I have also decided, she continued, because she had started now and she was going to finish, that I am tired of being the version of myself that other people find manageable. I have a great deal of money and I am very good at what I do, and I have hidden both of those facts for years because the alternative was to be treated as a collection of assets rather than a person. She met his eyes. I do not wish to hide them from you. I don't think you would ask me to. I would not, he said, immediately, completely. I know, she took a breath, that is rather the point. James set down his teacup. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and looked at her with an expression that was open and serious and entirely unguarded, in a way she had not seen from him before, the last layer of the composed, careful Duke of Ashford stripped away, leaving just the man underneath, who was tired and certain and looking at her like she was the clearest thing in the room. I would like to court you properly, he said, with your permission, formally, correctly, with calls and correspondence and whatever other machinery society requires. A pause, and I would like, eventually, if you are willing, to ask you a question that I nearly asked in a park last Wednesday, and that I think you already know the answer to. Clara looked at him. Her heart was doing something inconvenient and she was not going to look away. Properly, she said. Properly, he confirmed. Calls and correspondence. And whatever other machinery society requires. That machinery, Clara said, is considerable. I am aware. His mouth curved slightly. I have some experience navigating it. Clara looked at him for one long moment, at this man who had gotten so many things wrong and was trying, with great visible effort and some genuine grace, to get them right. Who had gone still at a dinner table and said nothing, and then come to her door and said sorry, and then come back again and again until she believed him. Who had called Lady Cecily personally, to apologize, who had a tenant school. Very well, said Clara. Something crossed his face, relief, she thought, and something warmer than relief. There is one condition, she said. Name it. The debt, she held his gaze. I am going to forgive it, the full outstanding balance effective immediately. I will have Mr. Graves draw up the documents this week. James stared at her. Clara, that is an enormous. I know what it is, she said. I am not forgiving it as a gift. I am forgiving it because I will not begin something with you while your family owes me money. I will not have it said not by your mother, not by anyone, that I acquired a duke through his debts. She raised an eyebrow very slightly. I intend to acquire you through entirely other means. James looked at her for a moment. Then he laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised out of him, warm and unguarded, and it changed his face completely, and Clara felt something loosen in her chest that had been held tightly for a very long time. You are, he said, when he had recovered, the most remarkable woman I have ever met. I know, said Clara pleasantly. More tea. He stayed 2 hours. They talked, really talked, the way Clara had not talked with anyone in longer than she wanted to examine. About the Lisbon contract and what it meant for the spring season. About the tenant school and how it had come to exist, which was a better story than she had expected, involving his father and a very determined local school teacher, and a significant quantity of rain. About books, he had noticed the maritime law texts. She was unsurprised to discover, before the first cup of tea was finished. And about London and about the estate in Shropshire that she had never seen, and that he described with a quiet affection that told her more about him than an hour of deliberate conversation would have. When he finally stood to leave, the fire had burned down again, and the clock said 7:30, and neither of them had noticed. At the door he paused, the same pause as before, hand on the frame but different now, carrying different weight. Thursday, he said, if I may call. Thursday, Clara confirmed. He put on his hat. looked at her once more with that open, unguarded expression that she was already, she suspected, going to have a great deal of difficulty being sensible about. "Good night, Clara," he said. "Good night, James," she said. She closed the door, stood in the hallway, pressed her hand flat against the door for just a moment, feeling the solid wood of it, the reality of it. Then she walked back to her office, unlocked the left-hand ledger and sat down at her desk. She did not open it. She sat for a long time in the quiet room with the dying fire and the locked ledger and the key in her pocket, and she thought about tenant schools and bad harvest years and a man who apologized properly when he had caused harm. She thought about being tired of being careful. She thought, perhaps not careful then, perhaps just this. She closed her eyes. She was smiling, the real one, the private one, and this time she knew exactly why. The news reached Lady Ashford on a Monday morning. Not through James. He had told her Sunday evening, after returning from Calloway Street, in the library where all their most significant conversations seemed to occur. He had sat across from her and told her quietly and completely. The debt was being forgiven. He intended to court Miss Voss formally, and he would appreciate her cooperation in the matter. Lady Ashford had said very little. She had asked 3 questions, practical ones, about the Hartley Company, about the extent of Clara's holdings, about the legal standing of the debt forgiveness. And James had answered them with the patience of a man who had prepared himself for a longer battle and was mildly surprised to find the gates unmanned. Then she had said good night and gone upstairs. James had stood in the library alone for a moment, looking at the chair where she had sat, and thought that he did not entirely know what that meant. His mother's silences were not all the same. Some were the silence of acceptance. Some were the silence of a woman who was regrouping. He suspected this was the latter. He was right. By Monday morning, Lady Ashford had done what she always did when she required information. She had sent notes, discreet ones, to 3 women of her acquaintance who between them knew more about the inner workings of London society than most men knew about their own estates. She had asked, with great casualness, about Hartley Trading Company, about the Voss family, about a young woman named Clara who had apparently been hiding an empire in plain sight on Calloway Street. The responses arrived throughout the morning, and they were, collectively, illuminating. Hartley Trading Company was not merely significant. It was, according to Lady Ashford's most financially informed correspondent, one of the 5 largest private trading concerns in England. Edmund Voss, who had been, it emerged, the second son of old Robert Hartley himself, the man who had built the company from a single wool contract in 1831 into the institution it now was, had inherited the directorship at 30 and expanded it substantially before his death. His daughter had taken the reins at 23, operating under the Voss name for reasons that several people seemed to know were deliberate, but none had chosen to advertise, and had in 3 years grown the company's revenues by a figure that made Lady Ashford set down her correspondence and look out the window for a rather long moment. The woman she had called a fortune hunter at her own dinner table. The woman who had sat beside a hard-of-hearing colonel and eaten lamb, and smiled the smile that Lady Ashford now understood had not been wounded dignity at all. It had been amusement. Clara Voss had been sitting at that table knowing that she held the paper on the Ashford debt, knowing that she could have produced it at any moment and watched the room rearrange itself entirely around her, knowing that Lady Ashford's cutting remarks were directed at a woman who could, financially speaking, have purchased Ashford House and used it for storage. And she had smiled and said the lamb was exceptional and gone home. Lady Ashford sat with this knowledge for a long time. She was not, despite what her behavior at that dinner might have suggested, a stupid woman. She was a proud one, proud in the particular way of people who have spent decades managing something precious and precarious, and have learned to protect it through sheer force of vigilance. The Ashford title was old. The Ashford estate was old. The Ashford money, and this was the part that Lady Ashford had spent 20 years carefully not examining too directly, was considerably less robust than the title and the estate suggested. She had known about the debt, had known about it as one knows about a chronic ailment, aware of it, managing it, not discussing it. She had not known who held it. She understood now why she had not known. And she understood, sitting alone in her morning room with her correspondence arranged around her, that Clara Voss had chosen not to use that information as a weapon, had chosen it, deliberately, over the course of 3 years, and then again over the course of the past several weeks when she had had every provocation to use it, and had instead walked away from a dinner table and said the lamb was exceptional. That was not the behavior of a fortune hunter. Lady Ashford was honest enough to admit this, to herself at least. The question now was what to do about it. She thought about it for 3 days. During those 3 days James called on Clara twice, on Thursday as arranged, and again on Saturday, and came home both times with the particular quality of distraction that Lady Ashford recognized because she had seen it once before, very long ago in his father. She did not ask him about it. She watched and thought, and was honest with herself in the privacy of her own rooms in a way that she was rarely honest anywhere else. She had been wrong. Not merely incorrect about Clara's financial situation. She had been wrong in a more fundamental way, the kind of wrong that was harder to examine and harder still to name. She had looked at a woman she did not know and assigned her a category and treated her accordingly, and she had done it in public, and she had done it cruelly, and the fact that Clara Voss was worth 3 times the Ashford estate did not make it wrong. It had been wrong before that was known. It would have been wrong if Clara had been exactly what Lady Ashford believed her to be. She sat with this too. It was not comfortable. Lady Ashford had not had a great deal of practice sitting with discomfort. She had spent most of her adult life arranging things so that discomfort could be avoided, arranging James's life, managing the estate's appearances, steering carefully around anything that threatened the image of Ashford's solidity she had spent 20 years constructing. It was exhausting work, and she had done it without complaint because someone had to and it had fallen to her. But she had sat at a dinner table and she had been cruel to a young woman who had done nothing to deserve it, and she had done it because the young woman had made her son smile in a way that Lady Ashford had not been able to control or predict or arrange, and that she could admit this here, alone, on a Tuesday evening in her sitting room was the real reason. Not the money, not the title, not the family. Fear. She had been afraid of a woman who made James smile like that because she had not seen it coming, and she could not manage it, and she had responded to that fear by being unkind. Clara Voss had known all of this, Lady Ashford suspected, had understood it with the clarity of a woman who had spent years reading people more carefully than they read themselves, and had said the lamb was exceptional. Lady Ashford made her decision on Wednesday morning. She called for her carriage. Clara was in her office when Mrs. Hale appeared in the doorway with an expression that was entirely new. Not the watchful look she wore for unexpected visitors, not the composed efficiency she maintained through most situations, but something genuinely uncertain, which was rare enough that Clara looked up immediately. "Lady Ashford," Mrs. Hale said. Clara set down her pen. "Lady Ashford," she repeated. "Yes, Miss Voss," at the door. Mrs. Hale paused with the delicacy of a woman choosing words carefully. "She came alone. No card sent ahead. She asked if you were receiving." Clara sat for a moment. She thought about a dinner table, about silk-wrapped cruelty and 20 people, and the particular quality of a room that has just watched someone be diminished. She thought about 3 years of quarterly payments accepted without acknowledgement. She thought about James, Thursday evening, sitting in this sitting room with his hat in his hands and his guards entirely down, saying, "I would like to court you properly." She thought about what kind of woman she was going to be about this. "Which room is warmest?" she asked. "The front sitting room. I've kept the fire going." Clara looked at the ledger open on her desk, closed it, did not lock it, a decision she made deliberately and without drama. "Show her in," she said, "and bring tea, the good china." Mrs. Hale's expression shifted almost imperceptibly towards something that might, on a less composed face, have been approval. Lady Ashford was smaller than Clara remembered. It was strange. At the dinner table she had seemed to fill the room, or at least the end of it, with the particular authority of a woman entirely at home in her own domain. Here, in Clara's sitting room, she was simply a small, silver-haired woman in a very good coat, standing near the door with her gloves in her hands and an expression that Clara had never expected to see on that particular face. Uncertainty. "Miss Voss," she said, "thank you for seeing me." "Lady Ashford," Clara gestured to the chair across from the fire, "please sit down." They sat. Mrs. Hale appeared with tea, the good china, as instructed, which Clara noted Lady Ashford's eyes moved to briefly with an expression she couldn't quite read. Clara poured without asking, because she already knew milk, no sugar. She had watched carefully at the dinner and handed across the cup. Lady Ashford accepted it, looked at it for a moment. "I don't know," she said, "how to begin this." "Then begin badly," said Clara. "It doesn't matter how you begin." Lady Ashford looked up. Something crossed her face, surprise, perhaps, at the directness, and then something else. "I was unkind to you," she said. "At my table, in front of my guests. I said things that were—" She stopped. "I said things that were untrue and unnecessary, and that I said because I was afraid, which is not an excuse, only an explanation, and perhaps not even a useful one." She held Clara's gaze with the effort of a woman who was not accustomed to holding someone's gaze in this particular way. "I came to apologize, not the kind of apology that repairs the person who gives it." She paused. Almost precisely, Clara realized what Clara herself had said to James. "I came because I was wrong, and because you deserved better, and because, a breath, because my son looks at you the way his father used to look at me, and I had forgotten until I saw it that that was something worth protecting rather than preventing." The room was very quiet. The fire crackled. The clock marked the quarter hour. Clara sat with the apology for a moment. Let it exist in the room without immediately doing anything with it. She had learned this from her father, that some things needed a moment before they were handled, not because they were difficult but because they were significant, and significance deserved a pause. "Did James tell you to come?" she asked. "No, immediately. He doesn't know I'm here." "Good," said Clara. "I'm glad it was your own idea." Lady Ashford looked at her. "You are not what I expected," she said. "When James first mentioned you, you are not what I expected at the dinner. You are not what I expected when I learned about the company." A pause. "I am not certain what I expected, but you are consistently not it." "I have found," said Clara, "that people generally expect less than I am. I have spent a great deal of energy accommodating that expectation. I am trying to spend less." "You should," said Lady Ashford, with a firmness that surprised Clara slightly. "You should spend none at all." She looked at her teacup. "I have spent my entire life managing what people expected of me, and I am—" She stopped. Something moved across her face briefly that was old and tired. "I am very good at it. I am not certain it has made me happy." Clara looked at her. This was not, she thought, the conversation she had prepared for. She had prepared for something more formal, more defended, more like negotiation. She had not prepared for a small, silver-haired woman in a very good coat saying true things in a quiet voice. "Lady Ashford," she said carefully, "I accept your apology." The older woman looked up. "I accept it," Clara continued, "not because the injury was small, but because the apology is genuine. I can tell the difference." She held her gaze steadily. "And because I think you are more than what you showed at that dinner table, and I am trying to extend to other people the same expectation that I ask them to extend to me." Lady Ashford was quiet for a moment. "That is very generous," she said. "It is practical," said Clara. "If James and I are if this is to become what I think it is going to become, then you and I will share a table for a great many years. I would rather share it honestly." A silence. Then slowly, something happened to Lady Ashford's face. Not a smile exactly, she was not, Clara suspected, A woman who arrived at smiles easily or quickly, but a softening, a loosening of something that had been held very tightly. "He told me about the debt forgiveness," she said. "I imagined he had." "That was," she stopped, tried again. "That was not necessary." "I know," said Clara. "That is precisely why I did it." Lady Ashford looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Voss," she said, "I think I have made a very significant error of judgment." "Yes," said Clara pleasantly, "you have." "I would like a pause." The word seemed to cost her something. "I would like the opportunity to correct it, if you will permit." Clara looked at her. At this small, proud, frightened, honest woman who had come to her door without a card sent ahead and without her son's knowledge, and had said true things in a quiet voice, and was now sitting in Clara's sitting room with good china in her hands asking, with as much humility as she probably possessed, for a chance to do better. Clara thought about her father, about what he had taught her, not just the ledgers, not just the contracts, not just the figures that told the truth about people. He had taught her something else too, that the measure of a person was not how they behaved at their best, but what they did when they discovered they had been wrong. "I permit," said Clara. They talked for an hour and a half. Not about James, or not primarily about James, which surprised them both. They talked about the estate, which Lady Ashford knew with an intimacy and a love that Clara recognized, because she felt the same way about the ledgers, the deep private attachment of someone who has spent years caring for something they could not entirely explain. They talked about the tenant school, which had been Lady Ashford's idea originally, not James's father's, though she had let the credit rest elsewhere because it was easier that way. They talked about the Lisbon contract, because Lady Ashford asked about it with a directness that suggested genuine curiosity rather than polite inquiry, and Clara found herself explaining the Wool Consortium with an enthusiasm she rarely got to express in social settings. Lady Ashford listened with sharp, intelligent attention and asked two questions that were, Clara acknowledged privately, very good ones. When Mrs. Hale appeared to refresh the tea for the second time, she caught Clara's eye with an expression that contained, very briefly, something that was definitely approval. When Lady Ashford finally stood to leave, the afternoon light had gone entirely, and the lamps were lit. At the door she paused, and Clara thought, with a private amusement she kept entirely off her face, that the Ashford family had a habit of pausing at doors. "I would like," Lady Ashford said, "if you would consider coming to dinner, a small one. This time you will be properly placed." A pause that carried some effort. "Beside James." Clara looked at her. "Next Friday," said Lady Ashford, "if you are free." "I will make myself free," said Clara. Something moved across Lady Ashford's face, relief, and something warmer. "Good," she said, "good." She put on her gloves with great precision. "Miss Voss," she said, without looking up from the buttons, "my son is not always good at saying the things he feels. He is better at showing them. The tenant school, the harvest year," she paused. "Watch what he does. It will tell you more than what he says." Clara looked at her. "I know," she said softly. "I have been watching." Lady Ashford looked up, met her eyes, and this time it was a smile, small, effortful, entirely genuine. "Yes," she said. "I rather thought you had." She left. Clara stood in the hallway and listened to the carriage move away down Calloway Street and thought about tenant schools and harvest years and a woman who had come to her door without a card and said true things and asked, with as much humility as she had, for a chance to do better. She thought, perhaps this is what it looks like. Not the perfect beginning, the corrected one. She went back to her office, unlocked the ledger, looked at the figures for a long moment, the Lisbon contract, the Hartley revenues, the line where the Ashford debt had been and where she had already instructed Mr. Graves to enter the forgiveness in red. She picked up her pen. Then she set it down again, went to the window, looked out at Calloway Street, which was dark now and lamplit and entirely ordinary. She was thinking about Friday. Friday came with cold, clear skies and the particular quality of winter light that made London look, briefly, almost beautiful. Clara arrived at Ashford House at 7. The same door, the same steps, the same butler who had admitted her the first time with the careful neutrality of a man paid to treat all guests identically regardless of private opinion. But this time, different. This time there was no placement at the far end of the table between a hard-of-hearing colonel and a young man with a horse. This time the gathering was small, 8 people, not 20, all of whom greeted her with the warmth of people who had been, she suspected, quietly briefed. This time Lady Ashford met her at the door herself, which was not required and was therefore significant, and said, "Miss Voss, I am so glad you came," with a formality that was none the less genuine. And this time James was there when she came into the drawing room. He turned when she entered, and the expression on his face, before he arranged it into something more composed, was the same expression that Clara suspected she was wearing herself and was managing with slightly more success. He crossed the room, took her hand briefly, correctly, in greeting. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace," she said. His eyes were doing something that was very difficult to look at steadily. "You came," he said, quietly just to her. "You asked," she said, "eventually." Something shifted in his face, amusement, relief, and something deeper than either. "My mother called on you," he said. It was not quite a question. "She did. She didn't tell me." "I know, that was the point." Clara looked at him calmly. "She came on her own, that mattered." James looked at her for a moment. "What did she say?" he asked. "True things," said Clara, in a quiet voice. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that open, unguarded expression that she had accepted by now, simply going to have to get used to. "Clara," he said. "Not yet," she said gently. "Dinner first." He almost smiled. "You are going to make me wait until after dinner." "I am going to make you wait until after dinner," she confirmed. Dinner was, by every measure, exceptional. Not the food, though the food was very good, but the texture of the evening, the quality of it. Clara was seated beside James, as Lady Ashford had promised. On her other side was an elderly gentleman named Sir William Hargrove, who turned out to know a great deal about Portuguese trade routes, and engaged her in a conversation that she found genuinely absorbing. Across the table, a woman named Mrs. Fenwick asked intelligent questions about the Hartley Company with the directness of someone who had done some reading before arriving, and Clara answered them without deflection, without reduction, without making herself smaller than she was. She was, she realized, somewhere in the middle of the soup course, simply herself, fully and without apology, and the table, this small, carefully chosen table, was receiving her. She glanced at James beside her and found him watching her with an expression of such unguarded warmth that she had to look back at her soup for a moment. Lady Ashford, from her end of the table, caught Clara's eye. She raised her wine glass very slightly. Clara raised hers in return. After dinner, the party moved to the drawing room. There was music. A young woman played tolerably well, and conversation that moved easily, and without the sharp undertow of social performance that Clara remembered from the first evening. James stayed near her. Not obtrusively. He was a man who understood the social mechanics of a drawing room, but consistently, steadily, in the way of someone who has decided where he wants to be and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. When the party began to thin, Sir William at 10, the Fenwicks at past, Clara found herself near the fireplace with James, slightly separated from the remaining guests, in the particular pocket of nearness that a diminishing party naturally creates. After dinner, he said, Clara looked at the fire. "So it is," she said. "I have a question I have been waiting to ask you," he said. "Since a park, in the cold," a pause, "since longer than that, if I'm being honest." "You should be honest," said Clara. "I find I prefer it." "I know you do." He was quiet for a moment. I have handled this very badly from the beginning." "Not from the beginning," said Clara. "You asked me yourself, in Harriet's drawing room, with your hat in your hand." He looked at her. "You remember that?" he said. "I remember everything," said Clara simply. He was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled between them. Across the room, Lady Ashford was speaking with Mrs. Fenwick, and Clara was aware, without looking, of the older woman's attention. "Clara," James said, very quietly, "I would like to ask you to marry me." The fire, the clock, the distant murmur of the last guests. Clara looked at him. She thought about Calloway Street and the left-hand ledger and the key in her pocket. She thought about 18 months of negotiation and a Lisbon contract signed in her own name. She thought about being smaller than she was so the world would leave her room to work, and about being tired, so tired of being careful. She thought about a man who stood outside doors in the cold, and apologized to young women properly, and maintained a tenant school in a bad harvest year. She thought about her father, who had loved a woman more than a name, and had taught his daughter that the ledger told the truth about people if you knew how to read it. She had been reading James Ashford for weeks. The figures were very good. "Yes," said Clara, "just that. Simply, completely, without qualification." James looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, the real one, the private one, the one she suspected very few people had ever seen. And it was, she thought, the best thing she had seen in a very long time. "Yes," he repeated, as though making sure of it. "Yes," said Clara. Across the room, Lady Ashford said something to Mrs. Fenwick that made the other woman laugh. She did not look across at the fireplace. She did not need to. She was already smiling. The dining room at Ashford House had not changed. The same long table, the same candlelight, the same portraits watching from the walls with the particular patience of people who had been watching for a very long time. The same silver that required 3 footmen to polish and that Lady Ashford had once told Clara, in a moment of rare candor, she had considered selling twice in the lean years and had not been able to bring herself to do either time. The same room, but everything else was different. It had been a quiet wedding. Clara had wanted that, not from modesty, not from any wish to diminish the occasion, but because she had spent enough years managing appearances for other people's benefit, and she saw no reason to begin her marriage by performing it for an audience. James had agreed immediately, which she had noted and appreciated. Lady Ashford had required a slightly longer conversation, during which Clara had listened patiently, and then said, very gently, that a small wedding now left room for a very significant dinner party later, at which Lady Ashford could invite everyone she wished and present the new Duchess of Ashford to society at whatever scale she felt appropriate. Lady Ashford had thought about this for a moment. "How small?" she had asked. "Family and close friends," said Clara, "20 at most." 30. 25. "Done," said Lady Ashford, and Clara had understood in that moment that they were going to manage each other very well. The ceremony had been on a Tuesday morning in early spring, in the church on the Ashford estate in Shropshire, with 23 guests and thin, cold sunshine through old stained glass, and James standing at the front of the church in a way that made Harriet Wyndham, in the 3rd row, reach for her husband's handkerchief before the service had properly begun. Clara had walked in alone. She had considered this carefully and decided that she was not a woman who needed to be given away, having never been anyone's to give. James had understood this without needing it explained, which had confirmed something she already knew about him. She had worn ivory, simple, well cut, with no ornamentation except the pearl at her throat that she had worn to the first dinner. A private continuity that only she knew the meaning of, and then James, when she told him afterward, who had looked at her with the expression she still had not entirely learned to receive without her breath catching slightly. They had said their vows. James had said his, looking at her in a way that made 23 people feel they were witnessing something private, and none of them look away. Clara had said hers steadily, completely, without a single qualification. Harriet had used the entire handkerchief. The estate in Shropshire was everything James had described, and several things he hadn't. It was large, larger than she had imagined, which was saying something, because Clara Voss Hartley had a well-developed imagination for scale. It sat in a valley between two low hills with a river running along the eastern boundary, and the kind of deep old trees that suggested the land had been cared for consistently for a very long time. The house was old stone, ivy-covered on the south face, with windows that were slightly uneven in the way of windows that had settled into their frames over centuries, rather than being put there recently. Clara had stood in front of it on the afternoon they arrived, and looked at it for a long time. "It needs work," James said beside her. Not defensively, simply honestly, in the way she had come to understand was his natural mode when he was not being a duke at anyone. "It needs love," Clara corrected. "Work is just what love looks like when applied to buildings." James had looked at her. "I'm going to write that down," he said. "You don't need to, I'll remind you." The tenant school was in the village, a 10-minute walk from the house. A solid stone building with 4 rooms and a yard, and a teacher named Mrs. Patterson who had been there for 11 years, and who greeted Clara on her first visit with the frank assessment of a woman who had very little time for pretense, and had decided, after approximately 4 minutes, that she approved. Clara had liked her immediately. She visited the school every week. She had proposed within the first month 3 improvements: a new roof on the east wing, an expansion of the lending library, and a small scholarship fund for promising students whose families could not support secondary education, and had funded all 3 from her own accounts before James had finished reading the proposals. He had found her at her desk that evening. "You didn't need to do that," he said. "I wanted to," said Clara. "It's a good school, it deserves to be a better one." James had looked at her for a moment, at his wife, at her desk, with her ledgers and her contracts and the key in her pocket and the complete, quiet confidence of a woman entirely at home in herself. "What?" said Clara without looking up. "Nothing," said James. "I'm just looking at you." "That is not a productive use of your afternoon." "I disagree," said James. Clara looked up, found him smiling, the private one. She had discovered in the months since the wedding that it appeared more frequently than she had initially thought, which she considered one of the more significant pieces of information she had ever gathered. She looked back at her ledger, but she was smiling too. The dinner party was in November. Lady Ashford had planned it for 3 months with the focus and precision of a general who has been given a very significant campaign and intends to distinguish herself. The guest list had expanded from 30 to 42, which Clara had noted without comment, and the menu had been revised 4 times, and the flowers had been a source of considerable discussion that Clara had removed herself from entirely on the grounds that she had a Lisbon contract that genuinely required her attention, and Lady Ashford was manifestly better qualified to have opinions about flowers. Lady Ashford had accepted this division of labor with something that was, increasingly, the expression she wore when Clara said something she found sensible. They had developed, over the course of the year, a relationship that Clara had not anticipated, and that she suspected Lady Ashford had not either. It was not warm, precisely, not yet, perhaps not ever in the way that some relationships were warm. But it was honest, and it was, underneath the honesty, something that Clara had come to think of as mutual respect arrived at through difficulty, which she valued more than warmth that had cost nothing. Lady Ashford had appeared in the doorway of Clara's office one afternoon in August, and stood for a moment looking at the left-hand ledger, and the papers spread across the desk, and Clara in the middle of it, all with her pen and her quiet focus. "Your father taught you all of this?" she had asked. "He taught me to read it," said Clara. "I taught myself the rest." Lady Ashford had looked at the room for another moment. "I have been thinking," she said carefully, "about the East Wing, the repairs. I have some thoughts about the funding arrangement if you are willing to discuss it." Clara had set down her pen. "Sit down," she said, "and tell me." Lady Ashford had sat down and told her, and her thoughts had been, Clara discovered over the following hour, genuinely good, detailed, practical, informed by 20 years of managing the estate through difficulties that she had never fully disclosed to James, and that she described to Clara with a directness that suggested she had needed, for a very long time, someone to describe them to. They had talked for 2 hours. At the end of it, Lady Ashford had stood, smoothed her skirts, and paused at the door, the Ashford habit, the door pause, which Clara had by now documented in at least 3 family members. "You are good at this," Lady Ashford said, not as a compliment exactly, as an observation, the kind one makes when one has been looking at something carefully and has arrived at a conclusion. "I know," said Clara. Lady Ashford had almost smiled. "Yes," she said, "I know you know. The November dinner was, by every measure, a triumph. 42 guests in the Ashford dining room, the silver polished to its best, the flowers deep red," Clara noted, "exactly right, arranged along the center of the table with the kind of restrained elegance that was Lady Ashford's particular genius." The conversation was warm and various, and ran from politics to the Portuguese wool consortium, to a lively argument about a recent novel that Clara had not read, but James had, unexpectedly, which she filed away as information about him she had not yet had. Clara sat at the end of the table. Not James's end, her own end. The Duchess's end. The chair that was hers now by right and title and the simple fact of occupation, and she sat in it with the ease of a woman who had not needed the title to know her own worth but was not, she had decided, going to pretend she didn't enjoy having it recognized. She wore deep green, sapphires at her throat, a wedding gift from James, chosen by him without assistance, which had told her something about how carefully he had been paying attention. Her hair was dressed properly for once, which Mrs. Hale had accomplished with the satisfaction of a woman whose efforts had been long underappreciated. She looked, Harriet had told her in the drawing-room before dinner, like someone who had always belonged here. "I have always belonged somewhere," Clara had said. "This is simply the first time the room agreed." Harriet had laughed and then looked like she might cry, which was Harriet's particular gift. The moment came near the end of dinner. The conversation had mellowed, the kind of mellowing that happened late in a good evening, when the wine had been poured twice, and the formality had loosened, and people were speaking with the ease of those who have been well fed and well entertained and feel, for the moment, that the world is broadly satisfactory. Lady Ashford, from her position midway down the table, a position she had ceded to Clara without the drama Clara had privately anticipated, in a negotiation that had consisted of a single conversation and Lady Ashford saying, with great composure, "It is your table now, I suppose," and Clara saying, "It is our table, I think," and Lady Ashford looking at her for a moment and then nodding once, raised her wine glass. The table quieted. Lady Ashford did not make speeches. This was known. She was a woman of precise language deployed sparingly, and when she raised a glass people paid attention because it was rare. "I would like," she said in the clear, composed voice that carried without effort, "to welcome my son's wife to this house, formally, as she deserved to be welcomed." A pause, barely perceptible, some time ago. The table was quiet. Clara looked at her mother-in-law across the candlelight and the flowers and the 40 years of Ashford silver. "She is," Lady Ashford continued, "a woman of considerable ability and considerable patience, both of which this family has benefited from more than it has perhaps adequately acknowledged." Another pause. "I am glad she is here. I am glad James had the sense, eventually," the word placed with surgical precision, producing a ripple of laughter, "to secure it." She raised her glass higher. "To the Duchess of Ashford," 41 people raised their glasses. "To the Duchess of Ashford," Clara looked down the table at James. He was looking at her, just at her, in the way he had of narrowing the room to the two of them without appearing to do anything at all. His glass was raised. His expression was the open, unguarded one, the private one, worn tonight without apology in front of 42 people. Clara raised her own glass, held his eyes. "I told you," she thought. "I told you I was not afraid of waiting." He smiled. The real one. Later, much later, when the guests had gone and the candles were burning low, and the house had settled into the particular quiet of a place that has held a great many people and is now holding only the right ones, Clara sat at the desk in what had become her study in the East Wing, the left-hand ledger open, the fire down to embers. James appeared in the doorway. He had taken off his coat. He leaned against the frame and looked at her the way he had taken to looking at her in quiet moments. Not the social gaze, not the public one, but the version underneath, which she had come to understand was the truest record of where his attention actually lived. "You should be asleep," said Clara without looking up. "So should you," said James. "I have 3 entries to finish. They will be there in the morning." "So will I, but I prefer to finish them now." He crossed the room, stood behind her, put his hands on her shoulders with the ease of someone who had learned, over the course of a year, exactly where they were welcome. He looked at the ledger over her shoulder, at the figures she kept in her own hand, the ones that told the truth about things. "We had a good evening," he said. "We did. My mother—" "Your mother was remarkable," said Clara, "as she generally is when she decides to be." A silence. Comfortable, the fire, the clock, the faint sound of the house settling. "Clara," James said. "You could have ruined us," quietly. He said it the way he had said it once before in this same tone at the beginning of things when he was still understanding what she had chosen not to do. He said it occasionally still, not obsessively, not with guilt, but with the quality of a man who had turned something over enough times to understand its full weight. Clara finished the entry, set down her pen precisely. "I know," she said. She closed the ledger. She looked at the fire for a moment. "My father used to say," she said, "that the ledger tells you the truth about people if you know how to read it." She paused. "I read yours very carefully." "And what did it say?" Clara turned her head and looked up at him over her shoulder, at her husband, in the lamplight, in the study that was hers, in the house that was theirs, in the life that she had built and chosen and refused to make smaller than it deserved to be. "It said," she told him, "that you were worth the wait." James looked at her for a long moment. Then he leaned down and said something very quietly, just for her, that was not recorded in any ledger and did not need to be. Clara closed her eyes. Outside, the Shropshire night was cold and deep and very still. The river ran along the eastern boundary of the estate. The old trees stood in the dark. The tenant school sat in the village, silent and waiting for morning, with its new roof and its expanded library and its scholarship fund that would send 3 children to secondary education in the spring. In the east wing of Ashford House, the fire burned low. The left-hand ledger sat closed on the desk, the key beside it, and for the first time in Clara Voss Hartley's adult life, she left them there without locking either one. She didn't need to. Some things she had finally learned did not need protecting. Some things were simply, completely already safe. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.